Most people never blame their childhood. They imagine trauma as something loud and visible, a home full of conflict, a parent who couldn't hold it together, moments that are simply impossible to forget. But there is a kind of pain that looks nothing like that. It grows up in quiet houses, in stable neighborhoods, in families where nothing was technically wrong, and nobody would ever describe the environment as harmful. And it comes not from what was done to you, but from something far more invisible, the consistent absence of someone who made you feel like your inner world was worth paying attention to. Psychologists call this childhood emotional neglect. And what makes it so difficult to recognize is that it doesn't leave the kind of marks you can explain to someone else. It leaves habits instead. Everyday habits that feel completely normal, habits that other people might even admire in you. But underneath each one is a child who learned to survive in a home where their emotional needs simply didn't register. These are 10 of those habits, and by the end of this, you may never see yourself the same way again. Habit 1. You say, "I'm fine," before you even check. Someone asks how you're doing, and before your brain has had a moment to process the question, the answer is already out of your mouth. "I'm fine." Not because you checked, not because you actually sat with the question for even a second, but simply because that response has become so automatic that it no longer requires any conscious thought at all. This isn't politeness and it isn't modesty. It's something that was trained into you over years of living in a home where your emotional state wasn't something anyone was particularly interested in, where you learned very early that the expected answer was always some version of fine. Not because you were fine, but because your real answer wasn't something the room had space for. So over time, you stopped checking altogether, and you disconnected from the question so completely that it became a reflex instead of a response. You aren't hiding your feelings from other people, you're hiding them from yourself, and you've been doing it so long that it no longer even feels like hiding. Habit 2. You feel guilty spending money on yourself. You can spend money on other people without a second thought. A friend's birthday, someone who needs help, a gift for someone you care about, and none of it produces any internal friction. But the moment the purchase is for you, something shifts almost immediately, and you find yourself hesitating, justifying, reaching for the cheaper version, or putting it back entirely and telling yourself that you didn't really need it in the first place. This guilt has very little to do with money and everything to do with worth. Because when a child grows up in an environment where their needs were consistently treated as secondary, where asking for something was regularly met with sighs, dismissal, or silence, they eventually internalize a belief that becomes almost impossible to shake, that their needs are an imposition, that wanting something for themselves is somehow selfish or excessive, and that they simply haven't earned the right to take up that kind of space. As an adult, that belief follows you directly to the cash register, showing up in every small moment where you choose the practical option over the one you actually wanted, quietly reenacting the same dynamic from your childhood, where your needs came last and you accepted that without question. Habit 3. You rehearse phone calls before dialing. Before you call the doctor, your boss, or even a close friend about something that matters to you, you run through the entire conversation in your head first, sometimes multiple times, anticipating their reactions, carefully preparing your words, adjusting your tone based on how you imagine they might respond, and thinking through every possible version of how the call might go before you've even picked up the phone. Most people write this off as being thorough or a little anxious, but the origin of this habit goes much deeper than ordinary nervousness. In a home where emotional responses were unpredictable and saying the wrong thing could result in withdrawal, irritation, or complete indifference, a child learns very quickly that communication requires careful preparation because you couldn't simply speak freely and trust that it would land safely. You had to calculate every word before it left your mouth. That calculation became so automatic over time that it embedded itself into how you approach any conversation that feels remotely significant. And now, decades later, your nervous system is still running that same preparatory process, even for conversations that carry absolutely no real risk.
Habit 4. Silence reads as punishment. When someone goes quiet, a friend who hasn't texted back in a day, a partner who seems a little distant, a coworker who didn't respond to your message, your nervous system doesn't register it as a neutral event the way it might for someone else. Instead, it immediately begins scanning for what you must have done to cause it, treating the silence not as evidence that someone is simply busy or distracted or tired, but as a signal that something is wrong and that you are almost certainly the reason. This response is a direct product of growing up in a home where emotional withdrawal was how the adults around you expressed displeasure, where silence wasn't a neutral state, but a loaded one that always meant something, and where you became so skilled at reading it that any quiet now automatically triggers that same internal alarm, even when the silence means absolutely nothing at all. Habit 5. You need a purpose to feel welcome in a room. Walk into a social situation where you don't have a clearly defined role, and an uncomfortable restlessness sets in almost immediately, a low-level anxiety that doesn't fully resolve until you've found something to do, helping with food, checking on someone, being the person who makes sure the evening runs smoothly, because once you have a function, the discomfort lifts and you finally feel like you have a legitimate reason to be there. This is the habit of conditional belonging, and it comes directly from a childhood where simply existing wasn't enough to guarantee warmth or attention, where being useful was the most reliable way to earn a response from the people around you. Habit 6. Being sick feels like an inconvenience you owe people an apology for. When you get sick, your first instinct isn't to rest or to take care of yourself. It's to manage the disruption your illness is creating for everyone else, to apologize for canceling, to push through things you shouldn't be pushing through, and to minimize how bad you actually feel, because asking for care carries this underlying sense that you're asking for too much. When a child's needs are consistently treated as burdens rather than legitimate parts of being a person, the body becomes just another domain where you're expected to be as low maintenance as possible and to handle things quietly without making it anyone else's problem. Habit 7. You scan neutral faces for hidden anger. Someone looks at you with a completely blank expression, not upset, not warm, just neutral, and your brain immediately begins working to decode it, running through possibilities, looking for subtext, trying to determine whether something is coming and whether you're in some kind of trouble that you haven't been informed of yet. This is hypervigilance, and it developed because in an emotionally unpredictable home, learning to read subtle shifts in someone's mood before they became fully visible was a genuine form of protection. It kept you safe when it mattered, but now it runs constantly in the background of your daily life, converting neutral expressions into potential threats and quietly exhausting you in situations where there is genuinely nothing to detect. Habit 8. You can't let someone care for you without immediately repaying it. Someone does something kind for you, pays for your meal, helps you with something difficult, reaches out when you're having a hard time, and even as you're thanking them, part of your mind is already calculating how to pay it back, not because you want to express generosity in return, but because receiving care without a transaction attached feels deeply uncomfortable, like a debt that's accumulating and needs to be settled before it grows into something you can't manage. This discomfort exists because in your experience, care rarely came without conditions or an expiration date, and the vulnerability of simply receiving something without immediately balancing the ledger feels like exposure, like you're leaving yourself open to something being taken back or used against you later. Habit 9. You shrink in groups until someone needs you. In a room full of people, you tend to go quiet and move to the edges, observing rather than participating, not taking up very much space. But the moment someone needs something, needs advice or help or just someone to talk to, something in you comes alive and you step forward without hesitation, suddenly feeling present and purposeful in a way that you didn't a moment before. This pattern belongs to someone whose presence was only consistently validated through function, someone who never quite learned that simply being in a room is enough of a reason to be there. Habit 10. You're more loyal to people who hurt you than people who don't.
The relationships you tend to fight hardest for are the ones where the other person runs hot and cold, sometimes warm and attentive, sometimes distant and dismissive, keeping you in a constant state of low-level uncertainty about where you stand, while the people who are consistently kind and reliably present somehow feel less urgent, less compelling, occasionally even a little suffocating. This isn't a character flaw, and it isn't a bad decision you keep consciously making. It's a familiarity response, because the emotional pattern of inconsistent love was the one that was modeled for you during the years when your nervous system was learning what love looks like, and so it became the template. Stable, reliable affection registers as unfamiliar and therefore a little suspicious, while unpredictability registers as intensity and realness. And without fully realizing it, you keep gravitating back toward the dynamic that first shaped you because on some very deep level, it's still the one that feels like home. None of these habits make you broken, and none of them mean there is something fundamentally wrong with you. Every single one of them made complete sense in the environment that originally created them, because your brain adapted to what it was given, and these patterns were the result of that adaptation. Recognizing them is the beginning of something, because you cannot change what you cannot yet see, and for the first time, now you can.